Eva Wim with NgenForce. I invite you to subscribe to our Substack newsletter, NgenForce, a human education for everyone. We discuss evolutionary topics. And here I am today creating a short introduction for Professor John E. Ikerd, because last week when we did the interview live, I started to record the interview after I had presented Professor Ikerd. So here it goes. I will read some of it because I don't want to miss anything. Professor John E. Ikerd received his Bachelor in Science from the University of Missouri, his Master's in Science from the University of Missouri, and his PhD from the University of Missouri as well. So he definitely knows the institution pretty well. He is a specialist in agricultural economics, and after working in the private sector, he dedicated 30 years to higher education as a professor in Oklahoma State University, North Carolina State University, the University of Missouri, and the University of Georgia. Professor Ikerd is also the author of several titles, which you can all find on Amazon and also on his website, johnnyikerd.com. These are Essentials of Economic Sustainability, A Return to Common Sense, Small Farms Are Real Farms, Crises and Opportunities, Sustainability in American Agriculture, and a Revolution of the Middle. I invite you to check out his publications on Amazon and also subscribe to his incredibly insightful newsletter via Substack. It's called Why Economics. It's one of my favorites. Remember to also subscribe to NgenForce on Substack, a human education for everyone. We discuss world resources, neurology, and how to be an optimal human based on scientific evidence. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the interview. If you do, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, as we will be uploading more insightful interviews along the way. Thank you.
Want to work, sooner or later, it's just going to collapse. So when you talk about sustainability, you're talking about the ability to continue to do something indefinitely into the future. And if you can't do that, then it's not sustainable. Now, when people also talk about sustainability, they typically talk about sort of ecological sustainability. It's got to be ecologically sound, or they may bring in social sustainability, socially viable, and then economically viable or economically viable over the long run is kind of the third dimension when people talk about sort of the three pillars of sustainability. And where that comes from is if you sustain something over the long run, you start by realizing that everything that's of any use to us as human beings, and sustainability is ultimately about sustaining us humans on Earth, sustaining a society, sustaining humanity, that everything that's any use to us, including everything of economic value, ultimately comes from the things of the earth. It comes from the air, the water, the minerals, the soil, even the sun, in a sense, is what I'm including with the earth, the solar energy that comes in. So there's no place else to get anything. So everything comes from the earth. That's kind of the ecological dimension. But beyond self-sufficiency, just meeting our needs from the earth, meeting our needs from just going out into the wilderness ourselves totally alone, then we have to depend upon relationships with other people within society. And so it has to be socially sustainable in the sense that we sustain those kind of relationships. And then if we want to live in a society that where we meet our needs by going beyond just simply relating to other people personally, when we relate to impersonal sorts of transactions, then that's where economic sustainability comes in. And so when we talk about economic sustainability from that perspective of being able to continue, doing what we're doing indefinitely, then it has to be ecologically sound and it has to be socially responsible in order to be economically sustainable. Because if you degrade or use up the usefulness of the basic Earth's resources, or if you degrade society to the point where it's dysfunctional, and you either have to go back to self-sufficiency, or you're going to do without. So you have to have a society that's functional in order to sustain an economy. And if you want to if you want to sustain a quality of life that's above just simply meeting your needs through relationships with others, then you have to have economic sustainability. And so when I talk about economic sustainability, I talk about the ability to continue to use the resources of the earth and to use the resources of society in the sense maintain those relationships society and do that indefinitely into the future. And the concern comes from sustainability because every time you use the things from the earth or every time you use society to do something that has economic productivity, you're degrading the usefulness of it. If you think about it from the standpoint of it really all comes back to energy because everything that we do requires energy. Even if we're self-sufficient, it requires energy for us to go out and pick or fruit from the trees or to hunt or whatever we have to do to meet our needs. So it requires some energy. It requires energy for our clothes, our cars, our shoes. Everything requires energy to make. It requires energy to use. And in fact, all of the material things are basically concentrated forms of energy. That was Einstein's E equals mc3 squared. Says that energy matter is just highly concentrated energy is what it says in there. If you look then at the laws of thermodynamics, the first law says the conservation of energy, which says you can't destroy it, but every time you use it, it loses some of its usefulness. It becomes less concentrated, less organized, less useful. Like when the fuel explodes in the cylinder of a car and gasoline, it's doing what nature does when it's disturbed. It expands, it dissipates, drives the car down the road. You didn't destroy that energy, but now it's heat, it's in the exhaust, and it's less useful than it was before. Or when you eat, just it's highly concentrated energy that you're eating, and then you break it down, you release the energy, you didn't destroy it, but the waste product then is less useful than it was before. And so no matter how efficiently you use the resources of the earth to support the economy, support society, over time you're ultimately degrading the usefulness of those resources. And so the only concept of sustainability is one of regeneration and renewal, which is only possible because of the inflow of solar energy. So ultimately, we have to capture enough solar energy, either through photovoltaic cells or waterfalls or wind, all that solar energy, or as being biological beings from the solar energy that's collected by green plants and then eaten by animals and then eaten by us because we're biological beings. So we have to have a regenerative, continually regenerative system that uses the solar energy to regenerate and renew the usefulness of nature and society. So that's what ultimately, that's the reason you can't sustain growth indefinitely, is because even if we're relying on solar energy, we're still relying on those other biological things, the plants, the animals, the other species, the natural ecosystem. And if we capture too much of the solar energy for ourselves, or particularly if we degrade the natural ecosystems, those living ecosystems that ultimately are responsible for our food and our biological energy, then we can't, if we expand to that point, then that's the ultimate limit of sustainability until the sun burns out. Now, nobody has figured out how we're going to sustain human life on the earth when the sun goes out, but I mean, that gives us a few years to work on it. I argue by that time, maybe we'll be totally spiritual beings and we won't need it.
Hopefully. It is really interesting because this idea that we still have some kind of degraded form of energy in the products that we produce. There is still the potential for energy in a plastic bag. There's the residue of oil as a derivative, right? And it's important to realize that yes, in everything that we produce, we still have energy, but in a very degraded form, and it will be degraded ever more so.
And your question about how typical businesses look at sustainability, they look at anything that kind of reduces the rate at which we're degrading. So if they talk about being more environmentally sound, they say, okay, have processes that are not polluting the environment as much as the others we were using. We're not degrading as much of the resources. We're making more efficient use of the resources. We're substituting renewable resources for non-renewable. And what you're doing is you're slowing the rate of unsustainable development,
Mhm.
but you still don't have sustainable development or sustainable quality of life. And you have people that argue, they say, well, sustainability is not enough. And they're saying, well, what we're doing now is not good enough. But what we're doing now is not sustainable. They're saying sustainability is just continue to do the same thing. Well, if you can't continue doing the same thing, then the same thing is not sustainable. It's not good enough. So the way I've defined sustainability here, I think, is consistent with, kind of that foundational principle. You can't sustain growth forever. I can't tell you how long we can sustain it. I can't tell you how much more pollution and degradation the earth will stand, but we're already seeing the negative consequences. That we're seeing the negative impacts on the earth that come back and affect us as human beings negatively. And ultimately, we can make the earth unlivable for humans. It may still be living things here, but we realize now that we can make the earth unlivable for us, and sustainability is about the sustainability of humans.
Absolutely. So I think that answered one other question that I had, which is, can economic growth ever be truly sustainable, or is it a contradiction in terms, practice?
Well, I think the economic growth is not sustainable over the long run. I can't tell you how long a run that you
Mhm.
can sustain it for the reasons that I've talked about here. It goes all the way back to the most fundamental laws of physics, the first and second laws of thermodynamics. It really goes all the way back to there. We even the material things of the earth degrade, even things we don't think of as being degrading that we have to rebuild. But even buildings and machinery, everything rots or wears out eventually, and it takes energy then to restore and renew those things, and it takes energy to build windmills. It takes energy to create dams. It takes energy to put together photovoltaic cells and things of that nature. And so if you want to restore the usefulness of the material things of nature. Now, when people talk about sustainable development, they say, well, sustainable development is not really sustainable because you can't sustain economic growth. And then they're equating development with economic growth. And that's where I would disagree with them. I think development is a sense of betterment. And I think you can have a betterment of human society without having economic growth, without having growth in the material that we do, because we're not just physical beings, we're social beings, we're ethical and moral beings. And there's all kinds of research. I was just talking to one of my friends, just reading a book that he says, I think it's called The Good Life. I've got to get it and read it, but I'm not really up to date on the studies that have been done. He says there's new studies that are being done with people all around the world, and when they study is what contributes to your quality of life. Well, up to a certain point, once you get to the point where you've met your material needs, then beyond meeting those basic needs, it's relationships that people look to. What improves their quality of life is the quality of their relationships within families and friendships and communities, a sense of belonging, a sense of being a part of something bigger than they are. And then also the earlier studies have shown that even beyond that, there's a sense of purpose and meaning in life. And so we have tremendous opportunities to improve in terms of our relationships within societies. We see this fractured society we live in here in the United States is just a perfect example of how a preoccupation with economic growth has caused us to basically ignore the importance of those social relationships, which I refer to as social values. They're inherently personal. There's a sense of personal connectedness that can't be bought and sold because you can't trade a friend to someone else. You can't sell or buy a friend. It's something different, and it's something special. And we've sacrificed that in the pursuit of economic growth, thinking it made our lives better, and it hasn't. and we've kind of lost our sense of purpose and meaning in life because we basically at some point, and this relates to one of the questions that you sent me, but there was a time when what we needed and what much of the world needs today was economic growth. We needed an improvement in our material well-being, our food, our clothing, our shelter, our healthcare, our education, those kinds of things. But we got preoccupied with meeting those material or economic needs, and we substituted that for kind of a purpose in life. And we've been pursuing this ever greater wealth, thinking it's going to make us better off, but it's distracting us from the value of these personal relationships. And we've lost our sense of purpose and meaning of why we're here. We've substituted just to make money and become wealthy has become a substitute for a life of purpose. And we're seeing the negative impacts of that. In our society today, we're seeing it particularly in the United States today. It's this loss of a common sense of purpose in this country and a degradation of relationships, the dissension, and all the focus on economic. We got to have more economic growth, more material well-being. We need a greater sense of social equity and economic equity of opportunity and justice, but that's social as opposed to economic.
That's one of of the questions that I have for you. When we think of economics, I was wondering if we can think of economics in terms of our relationships, monetary economics, which is I think what we've been distracted by is the monetary component of our economic resources. In particular, it's a monetary cult that we've developed. But perhaps we could think of the economics of our lives to include our relationships as well, in terms of how we handle our resources, specifically time, our energy, as we've mentioned. So thinking of ourselves as an individual economy, how we handle our resources to also tend to our relationships as we look for that monetary.
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental difference between the two. In my first book, Sustainable Capitalism, I talked about the individual economy, which is the transactions economies I talk about now, what we typically think is the economy, and then I talked about a social economy and then a moral economy. But the three are fundamentally different. And I wrote a recent journal article on this. It's in a business management international journal on managing sustainable business organizations. But anyway, that gets into this. But it's probably one of the most important things is to recognize what the economy is and what it isn't. And I think that's the reason for distinguishing between the three of those. And there's fundamental differences in economic value and economic relationships. Economic value is inherently individualistic. It's about what I can get as an individual. Things that have economic value only if they're of value to you as an individual. When you talk about a national economy, it's just an aggregation, adding up of all the individual businesses and all the individual enterprises that are there. There's nothing in the economy about the value of those economic relationships that are in, unless they affect the short-run profitability of the individual firms. That's the only thing that gets counted. So it's individual, it's instrumental. Economic transaction relationship is always a means to an end. You expect to get something of equal or greater economic value in return, or you don't make the transaction from a purely economic standpoint. It's individual, it's instrumental, and it's impersonal. And this is probably the most important distinction. Because you have to be able to buy and sell something in order for it to have economic value. It can be the most important thing in the world to you, but if nobody else wants it, it's not worth anything. Or if you can't sell it to somebody else. So that's the difference with social values. Social values are inherently personal. There's a sense of personal connectedness. It may be close personal connectedness, like with a spouse or a child or close friend or something like that. It may be, sociologists talk about reciprocity is a part of it, and that's another dimension of social relationship. There's an expectation of getting something in return, but it's different than an economic transaction because there's no specification of what you'll get or when you'll get it or
Mm.
whether it will be greater or lesser than what you do. You just know that you have to have a reciprocal relationship to sustain that relationship over time. And then what I was getting around to the sense of personal connectedness, sociologists talk about thin reciprocity and thick reciprocity. Thick reciprocity is those deeply personal relationships. The thin reciprocity is when you get where you're a part of a community, or you feel a personal sense of connected to the nation and patriotism. That's thin sort of reciprocity, but it's all personal. It's not it's not individual. It's not impersonal. You can't buy and sell your patriotism. You can't buy and sell your friends. You can't buy and sell your kids. It may be the most important thing to you in the world, but you can't give that relationship to anybody else. So that's different. Now, ethical or moral values are fundamentally different in that they're purely altruistic. They're not instrumental. They're not reciprocal. There's no expectation of getting anything. You just simply do it because it's the right and good thing for do. It's not personal or impersonal. It's universal. What's good for one is good for the other. And the sense of connectedness is spiritual. It's what I like to call it. But it's just this sense within yourself that you're part of something bigger and that you have some place to play and some purpose in life. And so all three of these are different, but you can't put an economic value on things that are purely social and things that are purely ethical or moral because they have no economic value. There's no way to transact them. There's no way to establish a market for them. Now there are things, and this is important when you're talking about businesses' approach to sustainability. There's a lot of things that we can do that have economic value that also help build social relationships. You build social relationships with people that you work with, or relate to in that way, or you can have a company that does something good for the community as a means of improving its public relations, which improves its economic bottom line. So there's cases where you get both kinds of benefits, and the same thing with the ethical and moral values. You can do well financially by doing good, they say, but that's because you have people that value doing things that are doing good, and they'll buy products, that they consider socially or ethical, whatever. So that's good from an ethical standpoint, but it also makes you some money. But those are two separate kind of values that just occur at the same time. You haven't put an economic value on the social relationships, and you haven't put an economic value on the moral relationships or the ethical relationships. And economists are always wanting to talk about, well, we'll internalize the externalities, and that's good if you do something economically that imposes an environmental cost that damages the environment, then you can estimate how much economic damage you've done to the environment, and you can internalize that cost. But you can't internalize what you've done that's going to be of damage to people of 3 to 4 generations in the future, because that has no economic value. It makes no economic sense to make an investment if you're not going to be around to realize the return on that investment. So you've measured the economic impact on the environment, or you can measure the economic impact of the negative impact on society in terms of reduced productivity or increased, as economists talk about, increased transactions cost. Well, you can put an economic value on that, but you can't put a value on the loss of a friendship. You can't put an economic value on the loss of community. You can only put an economic value to the extent that that loss of community or loss of friendship somehow contributes to the negative economic outcome. But if it's not a negative economic outcome, it's a social outcome. You've destroyed the social fabric of this community. Spent my whole life working in rural communities, and we've destroyed the social fabric of our rural communities by industrializing agriculture, exploiting and extracting the usefulness. And large corporations come in, they extract the benefits, and they leave the people, take advantage of the people, just like colonization. Well, you can put an economic value on the environmental damage and maybe the social damage, but you can't put an economic value on the destruction of those rural cultures and those rural communities and those families that have been torn apart. And you can put a economic value, for example, on doing things that destroy the public health by diminish public health by a degradation of the environment, the use of chemical pesticides and fertilizers and plastics and things like that. So you can calculate, well, we've got these kids now that have cancer in their teens, and you can calculate the economic value of the lost productivity and the cost of medical care. But you can't put an economic value on the fact that you've deprived that person of their quality of life. Their whole life is going to be lived ill, sick. That's not an economic value. That's a moral, ethical question. You see what I'm getting at?
Absolutely.
So,
I understand. And I think that's one of what makes it so hard to concretely argue for, and in a society where measurements and units are the way that we understand and
right,
digest information. So if we can't put a unit or an economic value to the loss of a life, deprivation, the obstruction of rural culture,
right,
then it's very hard to defend in the economic value terms that we've been conditioned to speak and to argue for.
right. That's a battle I fight all the time as an economist. In particular, people say, well, if you can't show people it's more profitable, they're not going to do it. If you can't show people they'll make more money, they're not going to do it. Well, I think that diminishes the kind of our perception of what humanity is all about. We know individually those things that we're talking about. No, I'm not just talking about you and me. I'm talking about people in general know that their quality of life is not just about how much money they have, how big a car they have, how many vacations they take, or how big a house they have. They know that if the relationships within their families break apart, they're miserable even though they live in the big house and they have the new car and all that. They know that those social relationships are important, and they know that if they lose that kind of the sense that what they're doing in their work, or if you're a politician, what you're doing in politics is in contrary to your ethical and moral values, that you know this is wrong, then we know these things as individuals. So what we have to do is to find the courage to say, if these things are right as individuals, they're right for us as families and as communities and as society as a whole. And I don't know any other way around this that doesn't, perpetuate the unsustainability of what we're having today. I mean, what we're faced with today, other than just say outright, we have to rearrange our priorities. There's a natural priority between sort of what I call the ethical and moral. That's where our sense of purpose and meaning in life comes from. And we have to accommodate our social values to that. We can't change what's right and wrong. We may not know exactly what's right and wrong. We may not know exactly how nature works with respect to all its laws, but we know if we violate those laws and those principles consistently, that's not sustainable. That we're not making our life better, we're making it worse. And so we know that we have this kind of the priority here, and then our social relationships have to conform to our ethical and moral values. We have to have friends and family and communities that will support and we support that are consistent with those core values of nature and of society. And then the economy has to accommodate the values of society. There has to be, in order to have a sustainable economy, that's where I come about, whether you want to call it sustainable capitalism, sustainable socialism, I don't care what you call it. You have to have that economy with functioning within the bounds, within the limits that are imposed by society, and the society that functions within the limits imposed by nature. And so, but what we've done is we've switched the hierarchy in our mind. We start off saying first it has to be economically,
Mhm.
it has to be profitable. We have to have economic growth. Now we'll do whatever we can, that's for the good of society, as long as it doesn't slow down economic growth, or as long as it, doesn't interfere with profitability. And we'll do whatever we can for the environment, as long as it doesn't impact our economic bottom line. But we got the priority upside down. As long as we stick with this priority, is everything economics takes priority over the social, and the social takes priority over what we have to do that's ethically, morally right, which is ultimately reflected in the fundamental laws of nature as well as the laws of human nature. If we, as long as we got those priorities wrong, we may do things that slow the rate at which we're unsustainable, slow the rate at which we're degrading society and nature, but it's not going to be sustainable. A friend of mine had come up with a useful analogy. He says, "Okay, if you're out here and you're headed for Mexico and you're going north, it's good to slow down, but ultimately you're going to have to stop and turn around." So what we're doing now is we're just going toward where we're ultimately it ends in a collapse of nature, a collapse of society, or whatever. We're just slowing down the rate at which we're moving toward um,
Mhm.
unsustainable society.
Definitely. I think that, well, if we look at the petroleum reserves at the current rate that we consume petroleum, we only have 45 years left of oil.
Yeah,
That is given that the rate of consumption doesn't change or that there are no new reserves that are discovered. But 45 years is very few years, really,
yeah.
for how much we depend on petroleum, for example.
Yeah, and people will come back though, and I was involved in made talks on peak oil, and when they were talking about peak oil back in the early 2000s, and we did reach peak oil with respect to the technology that we had for extraction. And then people will look at now we got into fracking, and now we've got, like you talk about, these reserves of the shale and that sort of thing. Well, back in when we talked about peak oil, we didn't know how to access all those. So as people come up and say, well, we'll find another source of energy, or you hear people talking now, and this is true, that solar energy is becoming cheaper than fossil energy. And we have to spend more and more to extract the fossil energy, then it's going to be more and more. Solar is going to be cheaper. But if we simply substitute renewable energy for non-renewable energy, we still haven't solved the problem of sustainability. We're still degrading the natural ecosystems. We're still leading to a more and more unequal society. One of the questions that came up was, does economic growth, is that necessary for increasing employment? Well, you look back at the statistics in terms of economic growth and employment, and there's one particular telling statistics that people brag about, but is the increasing productivity of labor. They talk about it since between the early 50s, well, post World War II and 1970s, we basically doubled the productivity of labor. Well, what does that mean? It means we employed only half as many people per unit of output or per increase in GDP, because that's saying how much did we produce per worker. You produce twice as much per worker. It's saying you're employing only half as many workers to produce the same amount of output. And we had another more than 75% increase between the 70s and the 2025 or so on. One thing, in that first increase going up to 1970, we had increases in wages basically that reflected the increase in productivity. But since then, we haven't. We've had very little increase in wages, increasing the productivity per worker, which means we've been reducing the employment, not increasing wages, and we're simply producing more and more by employing fewer and fewer people. So the economic growth that we've had, particularly in the last 50 years, has not been proportional to the increase in employment. And it's probably going to be even worse in the future as we go to more computerized systems and robots and artificial intelligence and these sort of things. These kind of technologies replace workers, they don't create jobs.
So, in this sense, if economic growth is not positively affecting the unemployment rate, then what are we after when we still want economic growth? If it's not employing more people, and if it's degrading our resources, air, nature, biodiversity, what is it, Professor, in your opinion, what is it that we are after when we are after economic growth?
We're preoccupied with this idea that somehow that if we had more economic growth, then we would be better off. And there's particularly the last 40, 50 years hasn't been consistent with that at all. But the reason that the economic growth keeps being driven, particularly by the the economists and by the business community is increasing economic growth is associated with increasing economic transactions. There's more money being exchanged. Those are transactions, each one of those. Everything that counts to economic growth, the GDP, is an economic transaction. In fact, much of the growth since the 1970s that I talked about before has simply been in households where before you had one wage earner. You had typically the male, but it could have been the female. You had one wage earner. And so during the 80s, 90s, 2000s, we've had two wage earners, which meant that you had people, let's just say the women, which was typically right, that were the homemakers. They were doing all these things at home, taking care of the kids and house and all those chores and things like that. And okay, when the women then went into the workplace, then they worked and they got a salary. Well, that salary added to economic growth, but also added to economic growth when they hired somebody for childcare and they hire somebody to do the cleaning and they buy more convenience foods and things of this nature. Now, I'm not arguing against women or anybody else working outside the home. I'm just saying that increased the economic transactions, and every one of those economic transactions creates the opportunity to make a profit on that transaction. And that's the reason that the corporate sector has grown. Those are purely economic entities because they're producing the products now that are being used by people that worked in the house to basically they're buying the same things they were producing before through personal relationships. The same thing happened in terms of people doing things for themselves. When I went through high school, we had a shop courses in the FFA or Future Farmers America, but a big part of it was shop. We learned how to do all sorts of things around home. I could do wiring and plumbing and fix almost anything, and I can still do that sort of thing. Well, the people don't do that anymore. The husbands or the man in the house that used to do those kind of things it doesn't know how to do them anymore. They spend all their time working, so they've got to hire somebody now to come in and do the electrical work and fix things. And mechanic, you couldn't think of fixing a car. We used to fix all of our own cars, do a car repair and all that kind of stuff. Well, people aren't doing things for themselves. It's every one of those transactions that creates to the economic growth, that creates the opportunity for somebody to make a profit out of it. And so the people that are profiting and the people that are getting ahead are the ones that continue to promote this propaganda. Basically, well, if everybody would work hard enough, long enough, smart enough, they would have more money and they'd be happy. Well, it simply hasn't worked. And I'm not convinced that the people that have worked hard and long and this sort of thing are happy unless that happened to be their purpose in life. I think some people are here to do things that basically make them wealthy, but that doesn't include most of us. We're here for something else to give our life quality, give our life meaning. Doesn't mean it's any less important than the people that are doing things that are making money. And if they're good at that and that's their purpose in life, fine. But if they're just doing it because that's somebody else's measure of success and somebody else's measure of what you ought to do if you want to be happy, there's no evidence to support that we're a happier, better, a more healthful society even. People are living longer, but we just discovered technologies that make a lot of profit for the drug companies and the healthcare industry that allow people to stay miserable longer before they die. So that's about what we've come to.
So, in sustainable capitalism, you talk about the moral dimension of sustainability. So, how have ethics been stripped out of economic decision making, and how can we bring them back?
Yeah. Well, I think that the reason I talk about it, ultimately, it becomes a moral issue. It goes back to explain the difference in social value, ethical value, economic value before, is because if we talk about sustainability, and I mentioned sustainable development, the Brundtland Commission's definition of sustainable development, I think, is an accurate definition as far as sustaining humanity. It's specifically focused on sustaining human civilization. It says we have to meet the needs of the present without diminishing opportunities for the future. So it says meet the needs of the present. It means we have to meet the basic needs of all in the present. It doesn't mean everybody has to have all of everything that they want and everything they could aspire to, but everything they need to reach that level, or beyond that level, It's simply a matter of relationships, and it's simply a matter of personal ethics and having some sense of purpose and meaning. So it means you have to meet that. And if you think about it, if you're talking about meeting the needs of the future, then you can't expect people that have hungry children that are in conflict situations like we see in Gaza and like we see in Ukraine. You can't expect those people to be concerned about climate change, or you can't expect them to be concerned, about whether or not the people in the U.S. are wealthy enough or income distribution or whatever. You've got to meet the basic needs of people. But there's no economic value in doing anything solely for the benefit of somebody else. And there's really no social value in doing anything for the benefit of somebody else if there's no way you're going to get anything in return out of that relationship with them. So that's an ethical and moral decision to meet the needs of the present. And then certainly when you talk about leaving equal or better opportunities for people of future generations, there's no economic value in that. Economic value is individual. It makes no economic sense for somebody like me, it's 85 years old, to make an investment if the return is going to be 20 years from now. I'm not going to be here 20 years from now. And because the future is uncertain, that's the reason we have interest cost, because people have to give up the opportunity of having the money now, waiting for the future, or people are willing to pay interest because, like on a house or something like that, they can use it while they're paying for it or something. But economic puts a priority on the present relative to the future because it's individual and it's instrumental. So there's no economic value. For example, at an interest rate of 7%, for example, if you're paying that, a dollar 10 years from now is only worth 50 cents today. And if you look at these big corporations that are like earning 10, 15% return on their investments, anything that happens 5 years from now is worth 50 cents on the dollar. So that's the reason they have 5 to 7 year planning horizon. So there's no economic value when you talk about 3 or 4 generations in the future. And there's no social value in it because you're not going to know anybody in that generation. So the only reason that you would do anything to meet the needs of everyone in the present or to ensure equal opportunities for the future is because you feel a moral, ethical obligation to do that. You feel that you're here on earth for a purpose, and part of that purpose is to be caretakers of each other and be caretakers of the earth. And if you don't have some sense of that, you don't have to articulate it the same way I did, but if you don't have some sense of responsibility, of being responsible to the greater society, of helping other people, and if you don't have some sense of commitment to caring for the earth as a part of that system, if you don't feel a sense of interconnectedness with other people and with the earth, that your own self-interest is somehow tied up in the well-being of society and of nature, then really sustainability is just a bunch of nonsense. And we need to, kind of face right up to that's what we're talking about. This is ultimately an ethical question, and the fact that we have an unsustainable society is an ethical, moral problem. I don't know if you've read Pope Francis's encyclical, they call it encyclical on climate change, but it's called Care of Our Common Home. It's one of the best. I just wrote something and said it's kind of a best explanation of the spiritual dimension of sustainability that I've seen, because he come around with integral ecology. Everything is interconnected. We're all part of the same whole. We don't have a social problem, an economic problem, and an ecological problem. A social, ecological, and economic problem. They're all part of the same problem, and we can't solve one of those problems unless we solve them all.
Do you think
And
it's a spiritual
it's
problem?
not something you rationalize. That's something that's spiritual.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you. If you believe this is a spiritual problem fundamentally.
How do we do it? The only way I know, and of course, if I actually knew how, I'd tell everybody and we'd all be doing it. But the only way I know is kind of what I alluded to before, is to say that we know in our hearts that our well-being is not just about our economic well-being, not about our material well-being, how much stuff we have, how cheap we can get it, how much money can we. We know that's important up to a certain level. We need to have basic needs that we need met. We know beyond that, it's a matter of relationships with families, communities, sense of belonging, a sense of being part of something bigger. That's our social responsibility. And it's also having this sense of purpose and meaning, of realizing that we're here for a purpose. Life doesn't make any sense if there's not a purpose. If there's no purpose for you and me being here, then why get up in the morning? But again, why not? What difference does it make? If we don't have there's no reason for us being here, nothing makes sense. Nothing makes any difference. There is no right or wrong because there's no way to tell right. If you're not supposed to do something, then how can you tell where what you're doing is right or wrong? Because there's nothing in particular you're supposed to do and nothing in particular you're not supposed to do. So we know in our hearts that we have a purpose of being here, and that no one is more important than anyone else, that if we each do what we can do in our little piece of the world, like you and I are trying to do here today, then I think that's what we can contribute to this. But we have to be able to, to tell people that's basically where it starts, is we have to try to build communities, and we have to try to build societies that reflect what we individually know in our heart and soul to be right and true.
Thank you. So, Professor, what is degrowth? What is degrowth, and how does it differ from recession or collapse? Is
Yeah.
it something to be afraid of?
Yeah.
Economic.
Well, I think degrowth ties into what we're talking about here. Degrowth is probably a more of a threatening word than it needs to be. Some people talk about reset or things like this, but what it's really about is rebalancing the economic with the social and the ecological and that sort of thing. And it's based on the assumption that we're putting too much emphasis on economic growth, and that we're going to have to de-emphasize economic growth in order to de-emphasize those social and ethical dimensions of what it takes for a desirable quality of life. And if you look at the measures that they look at in terms of degrowth, then those measures are social measures, and they're ecological measures, and they're ethical sort of measures and things like this. And so it's not so much economic degrowth, it's a reprioritizing and moving away from economic growth as kind of the driving force to trying to bring economic growth down in order to balance it with the social and ethical responsibilities. That's the way I like to think of degrowth. And it's voluntary in the sense of when you realize that your life is not made better by spending more time working, trying to make more money, if it's diminishing the quality of your relationships and you don't feel good and right about what you're doing to make the money. And so it says we need to spend more time and effort on relationships. I've written in many cases, that's the biggest challenge of sustainability is human relationships. I really believe that, because we've basically forgotten how to form and how to sustain personal relationships with friends and in communities and families and this sort of thing. I'm prime example of that. I grew the first half of my professional career. I was very much kind of a traditional agricultural economist focused on the economic bottom line. It spilled over into my personal life. I thought I had to go through the university system and get promoted from one job to another and get a raise. I wasn't as focused on the money as I was on, increasing in rank from assistant to associate to full professor and things of that nature. And I was focusing on that, and I ended up absolutely miserable. I was making good money. I was ahead of an extension agricultural economics department at the University of Georgia. That's when I shifted over and said, I need to go do something different. And I don't think I'm anything special. I think anybody can do the same thing, is to come to the realization that what we're doing isn't working. And since I went through degrowth, when I retired, my retirement income was a little over half of my salary. I could have worked another 10 years. I had degrowth. My quality of life went up 100%. I could do the stuff I wanted to do. So as I say, I'm not a particular outstanding moral, social, responsible person. I think anybody that stops and really thinks about this would think about, okay, maybe I'd be better off if I didn't work so hard, didn't work so long, if I took a job that I really wanted, that I really loved, rather than this job that makes a lot of money. I was at the University of Missouri at a seminar in there's University of Missouri School of Law put on the seminar down there. And they were dealing with environmental issues. This was on agricultural policy that I was talking on there, but I had an opportunity to ride around. They kind of shuffled me around with the students that were finishing their law degrees, and I'd always ask them. I'd say, "Well, this was kind of the end of the semester, and they were all in the job market." I'd say, "Well, what kind of job are you looking for?" And everyone I talked to, because of this program, they'd say environmental law, social justice law, and that sort of thing. And then I'd ask them, "Well, what kind of job have you taken, or what kind of interviews you had?" And it was always with big corporate law firms. They say, I got to get out and go out and make some money and get the return on all this investment. It's not really what I wanted to do, but the environmental law part didn't pay as much and something like that. So you get kind of locked into this. But I think if you start thinking about what's important in life, and then you would find that a lot of people that are working too hard. They're making more money than they need to make. A lot of corporations have people in them. Well, it's one thing I need to say. A for-profit corporation, a publicly traded corporation, is a purely economic entity. That's what it's created for. That's what it does. The only common interest of the shareholder, and that's what they're obligated to serve, is a desire to increase the economic value of their stock. And they may only own a stock for a day or two, and they may not even know which stocks they own. So there's no way they can reflect their social and ethical values through those stocks. So that's a purely economic entity. But if you have a family held corporation, a closely held corporation, or if you're an individual, we have a lot of people, a lot of farmers out here kind of caught in this industrial agriculture cycle because of the government programs are paying them to be in there, but they'd like to be somewhere else. And their life, I would argue, for most of those people, there's a lot of people caught in this system that's not consistent with their ethical values. It's not good for their families. It's not good for the communities. That if they really stopped and think about it, they would be better off with less income, better relationships within the families, a more of a sense of authentic purpose, creating a regenerative, resilient, economically efficient, sustainable agriculture. So
Go ahead, sir.
So that's kind of what I think along those lines of degrowth is that it needs to be kind of, think of it as a rebalancing. And we need to reduce our emphasis on growth where that's the thing that's diminishing the quality of life. And then there's countries in the world, and there's people, a lot of people in this country that actually need growth in income. They need growth in economic well-being. So not everybody needs to degrow. Everybody needs to balance. Some people need a lot more economic well-being relative to social and ethical. Other people need less economic. And that, to me, that's what regrowth is about.
I think that's very important to consider the individual scenario of a person and say, well, given my individual scenario, where do I need to rebalance? Where do I need to degrowth and grow? And accept that it does take courage to take the decision to degrow economically in favor of a better quality of life. So I think your example is very illuminating on how it takes courage to degrow economically in favor of a better quality of life.
Yeah, I can speak, personally to that. My whole career path changed. I was president of the Southern Agricultural Economics Organization. At the time, I decided to change. All of a sudden, my colleagues thought was deranged or something. All of a sudden, get the rumors come back. Well, John Ikerd's not really an economist anymore. I said, well, I used to be when I was president of the association. I used to be, when I was publishing journal articles and all that kind of stuff. What happened to me? But anyway, and it changes your career path. All of a sudden, I realized, like I said, I was a department head. I realized when I changed and started being critical of industrial agriculture and promoting sustainable, I wasn't going to be a dean. I wasn't going to be an extension director. I wasn't going to be any of those aspirations that I kind of had in the back of my mind that I might end up being. So you have to really believe, that this is what you need to do with your life. So I'm not saying that I just wanted to make that point because I know it's not an easy decision to do that. And then another thing is I was making a good salary. I could live on half of it. I couldn't live affluently. I couldn't live at the same level I did before, but I could live. There's a lot of people that couldn't can't live on half of what they're getting now. So I'm not saying everybody should do what I did. I'm just saying everybody needs to look at their own situation and say, what is it I need? Do I need more time with my family and friends? Do I need to work somewhere where I feel better about what I'm doing and what I'm contributing to society and my community? And if you don't, then maybe you're in balance, maybe you're in harmony. Or do you need more economic output? If you need more economic well-being, material well-being to meet those needs of your family, then you need to look for opportunities to do that, but try to find opportunities that won't cause you to, destroy your family relationships or compromise your values.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Professor. It has been really insightful. If you don't have anything else to add, I would like to open the floor for questions. Maybe our viewers have some questions or any reflections, thoughts that you would like to share. I would ask you to unmute if you have any questions. There you go. Please go ahead.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you, NgenForce and Professor, for your time and for this wonderful exposition of your thoughts and insight. I guess I'm more no, I don't want to use worried, but a bit skeptical that on the course that we are, that we are going to be able to steer it in a more sustainable way, to use the theme of the of what we're discussing today. I see, for example, at my age, at your age, Professor, we've had all these experiences, and we grew in a system of growth, of capitalism, of accumulation of wealth in order to attain the goods or benefits that we were told are what makes life good. So, but in that sense, the generation that comes after us, that I think is more intelligent and understands this problem that we have, of, like you said, unsustainable. Is you cannot do it forever, but at the same time, these kids have realities that they need to pay rent, that they need to pay for the cost of living, and so on, and it probably becomes a priority for them to get on board this path that we're in or on, versus having the courage of undertaking the altruistic and correct path of trying to change course or minimize the course that we're in. So I wish I was more optimistic on how this can be mitigated somehow. I just don't see the focus, or rather the forces that are pulling to each side are I think it's difficult to embark on the course of sustainability, so on, versus the needs that people have because of the societies that we created. Because of so I think it's, unless we have at some point, I don't know in how many decades from now, some type of black swan that shakes everything and brings people to focus and really steer course, it's very difficult to change course.
Okay. I tell people, ask this kind of question. I tell people, I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful.
Of course.
And I'm hopeful. What that means is that change is possible, and where that comes from is that we human species, as far as we know, are the only ones that can can look out here in the future a couple of hundred years and anticipate, or even 50 or 100 years and anticipate. If we continue to do this, this is going to be the consequences. It's not anything that we as human beings have ever experienced before. So it doesn't come from our experience. We can look at trends that are going. But we have the ability to say that what we're doing is not sustainable if we come to that conclusion. And I look at it and say, well, why were we given that ability? Why do we have that ability as human beings to look out here in the future and say, if we continue to do what we're doing, it's not sustainable. The whole society is going to collapse. We're going to destroy the livability of the earth and just continue to do it anyway. I don't believe that we're given that ability just to make us absolutely miserable our whole life, waiting to see if it's going to collapse in our lifetime. I think we have that ability because we were meant to use it. We have the capacity to use it or not use it. So at the very foundation, we have the capacity to change things. It's up to us to decide it. Now, where the part of the hopefulness come from is what you talked about. The young people that I interact with, that I talk with, like Eva here and others. I've done a podcast for some time with a young lady that's still in her 20s. She may have just turned 30, but anyway, we were talking about future farm policy and her generation. They realize that what we're doing now is probably going to last long enough for us old people for the rest of our lives. Maybe not, but you're probably younger than I am. But anyway, it very well will probably last through my lifetime. But they realize it's not going to last through their lifetime. These young people that are very bright and are looking at these things and educating themselves on them, even if they feel like they're trapped to going into a situation now where they have to make some money, they already know in the back of their mind, this thing's going to collapse before I get to be 85 or before I get to be 50. And they have a stronger motivation because they realize that we're getting closer and closer to it. But I tell people that we can say it's sustainable or not sustainable, but what we're doing now, just ask people, can we continue doing what we're doing indefinitely? And I think you'd find most people would say, no, we can't continue doing this indefinitely. I can't tell you how long we can continue, but if we don't use this God-given intellect or wherever you think it comes from to anticipate a future and then do something fundamentally different as a consequence of that knowledge, then we will, in fact, as a human civilization, we will collapse. That's inevitable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely. The stakes are very high. The stakes are very high. We can continue on the path that we are, and we can collapse as humanity. And I think that the young people like myself, we worry about our own children because that's when the real problems will start beyond my lifetime, but for my children. So it is a real concern. Although, to be honest, in my generation, we have a little bit of everything. We have people that are consumerist based, that are absolutely nonchalant about the situation and blindsided, and people who are adamant about making money to the point that all of this information, which is logical, still gets ignored on a daily basis. And it is very hard to deter the momentum. But hopefully, I am hopeful as well.
Yeah, Eva, you had one question about community, and that's another dimension of what we're talking about. And so people tend to look like you're doing here and say, well, we can't change society. It's so big, there's no way we're going to get it done. And I agree with you. It just looks impossible. But we can change our relationships and we can change our communities. And that's what I encourage young people to do, is find like-minded young people or old people or whatever, and relate to those people. Don't worry so much about, I used to tell people when I'm talking about local foods with farmers, they say, well, how are we going to get the Walmart shopper to buying really good food that comes from a local farmer that's more expensive? And I say, the Walmart shopper isn't your customer. What you need to do is to provide food for those people out here that really want something different than Walmart and don't know where to find it and don't know how to do it. So if you find like-minded people that you can relate to and you begin to feel build, what I'm talking about is building communities within communities. Not trying to change even a whole community, but get a community of friends and expand that community, and then start thinking about how do we relate more with personal relationships to do things within our community for ourselves and for each other, and then how do we help each other out, and then begin to talk about how do we make better use of what government programs are there to meet the real needs of people rather than just depend on the impersonal kind of extraction of money or whatever. So, and the other thing is I tell people, I say, okay, if you spend your lifetime doing that, working out those relationships, doing something you really feel good about, even if the rest of the world doesn't change, you've had a wonderful life. You've had a good life that you can be proud of, even if the rest of society doesn't change. You've done your part. And I think that's all any of us can do is we've got a little part here that isn't going to change the world by ourselves, but it's our part. And if we think our part isn't big enough or it's not going to impact things, and we end up not doing our part because we don't think it's important enough or we think it's hopeless, then we haven't done what we could do. And then, why would we expect anybody else to do that? If we each do our little part, then we have to really trust that what needs to happen will happen. And there's really nothing more important that we could have done than to do our part. I argue if we can walk what I call walk a path of purpose, it's not something to be achieved, it's a way of life to be lived, then we will have lived the best life we could possibly have lived, and we will have made the greatest contribution we possibly could have made to the greater good of humanity. And if we focus on that, and then we begin to build relationships and we begin to do whatever we can do, then I think we've done all we can do to change civilization, and then we will be in a better position also to endure whatever happens if the rest of civilization doesn't change.
It's brilliant. I think those are excellent closing comments. I am very grateful for that. And I want to leave our audience with that message that we can do our part. And as Professor Ikerd says, walk a path of purpose and live a life of purpose.
For sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, Professor. Thank you, NgenForce. Eva, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if Maria has any comments or reflections that she would like to share, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I really did enjoy all the information the professor said, and actually it reminds me a lot of the third dimension and fifth dimension of what we're living now.
Thank you.
Good. Yeah.
Thank you, Maria. Well, thank you to all of you who joined us today, and let's continue to walk a path of purpose ever more so. Thank you.
Looking forward for more meetings like this.
Bye, Professor. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
I really appreciate your time, and I hope we can keep in touch. I've really enjoyed reading your essays, especially the essay that you wrote last week, and also the one on indigenous agriculture, which I did share with my readers.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, just keep up the good work, okay? And send me if you send me a link to this program whenever you post it online, then I'll post it on my Facebook and LinkedIn pages.
Sure. Thank you so much. I will. I'll send you the link also to the newsletter so you can see whenever I you and so on.
All right. Okay. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good week.
You too. Thank you very much.